The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Captain Sarah Chen as she crouched behind the damaged communications tower. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, and dust clung to every surface of her equipment. The morning had started like any other routine patrol mission, but everything changed when the enemy convoy appeared on the horizon. Sarah had been commanding the 3rd Armored Division's forward reconnaissance unit for 18 months. At 28, she was one of the youngest female commanders in the sector, having earned her position through countless hours of training and several successful missions. Her unit consisted of 12 soldiers and 3 advanced rocket launcher systems mounted on armored vehicles. The intelligence reports had been clear that morning. Enemy forces were moving supplies through the valley, and Sarah's unit was tasked with disrupting their operations. The plan was straightforward: position the rocket systems on the ridge overlooking the main road, wait for the convoy to enter the kill zone, then launch a coordinated strike. Everything seemed perfect as they reached their positions before dawn. The rocket systems were calibrated and ready. Sarah's soldiers were alert and prepared. The enemy convoy was expected to arrive within 2 hours, giving them plenty of time to ensure everything was in working order. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah received confirmation through her radio that the enemy convoy was approaching. 15 vehicles, including several heavily armored tanks and supply trucks. This was exactly what they had trained for. Sarah gave the order for her teams to prepare for engagement. The convoy appeared right on schedule, moving slowly through the narrow valley road. Sarah counted the vehicles through her binoculars, noting the positions of the tanks and identifying the most valuable targets. The lead tank was massive, clearly their command vehicle. Taking it out would cripple their entire operation. Sarah gave the signal to her rocket teams. The first launcher should have fired immediately, but nothing happened. She tried the radio again, calling for the strike. Still nothing. A cold feeling of dread began to form in her stomach as she realized something was terribly wrong. Running to the first rocket position, Sarah found her soldiers frantically working on the launcher system. The electronics had completely failed. The targeting computer showed only static, and none of the control systems were responding. Sergeant Martinez looked up at her with frustration written across his face. The second rocket system had the same problem. The sophisticated guidance systems that made these weapons so effective had somehow malfunctioned simultaneously. Sarah quickly realized that this was no coincidence. The enemy had likely used some kind of electronic warfare device to disable their systems. Down in the valley, the convoy had stopped. Sarah could see soldiers getting out of the vehicles and setting up defensive positions. They knew they were being watched, and they were preparing for an attack. Time was running out, and her unit's advantage was disappearing with each passing minute. The third rocket system was their last hope, but as Sarah reached the position, she found the same devastating news. All their advanced technology had been rendered useless in a matter of minutes. The enemy had effectively neutralized their primary weapons without firing a single shot. Looking down at the convoy through her binoculars, Sarah watched as the enemy soldiers began moving into attack positions. They were no longer content to simply defend themselves. They had realized that the ambush had failed, and now they were preparing to hunt down Sarah's unit. Sarah gathered her soldiers around her, their faces showing the same mix of confusion and concern that she felt. They had trained extensively with these rocket systems, but no one had prepared them for complete system failure. The mission parameters had changed completely, and they needed a new plan immediately. The enemy tanks were beginning to move, spreading out to search the surrounding hills. Sarah knew that once those tanks reached higher ground, her unit would be completely exposed. They had perhaps 20 minutes before they would be under direct fire from weapons far more powerful than anything they carried. As Sarah studied the terrain around them, her mind raced through possible solutions. The rocky hills provided some cover, but not enough to hide from thermal imaging systems. Their vehicles were fast but lightly armored compared to the enemy tanks. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Then Sarah remembered something from her advanced training course. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach wasn't the best one. Sometimes victory required going back to basics, using tactics that the enemy wouldn't expect. As she formed a desperate plan in her mind, Sarah realized that this mission was about to become the greatest test of her career. Sarah's mind worked quickly as she assessed their resources. While the rocket systems were useless, each soldier still carried personal weapons, grenades, and most importantly, explosive charges designed for sabotage operations. These weren't sophisticated guided missiles, but they were reliable and wouldn't be affected by electronic interference. She called Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Williams to her side. Both were experienced soldiers who had served with her for over a year. They had complete trust in her leadership, which would be crucial for what she was planning. The enemy convoy had positioned itself in a defensive formation in the valley, below. 3 tanks formed a triangle around the supply vehicles with infantry spread out in a perimeter. They clearly expected an attack from the hills above, which was exactly what Sarah intended to give them, but not in the way they anticipated. Sarah explained her plan to her 2 senior soldiers. Instead of trying to engage from long range, they would divide into 3 teams and approach the enemy positions from different directions. The goal wasn't to win a firefight, but to get close enough to plant explosive charges directly on the enemy vehicles. Martinez shook his head immediately. The plan seemed impossible. The enemy had superior firepower and defensive positions. Getting close enough to plant charges would require crossing several hundred meters of open ground while under fire. It was the kind of mission that usually ended with heavy casualties. But Sarah had studied the terrain carefully. The valley had several dry creek beds and rocky outcroppings that could provide cover for a careful approach. More importantly, the enemy was expecting a high-tech assault from the hills. They wouldn't be watching for soldiers crawling through the dirt with handheld explosives. Williams pointed out another problem. Even if they could get close to the vehicles, planting charges would take time. They would need to disable the tanks simultaneously to prevent the others from escaping or calling for reinforcements. Coordination would be critical, and they had already lost their primary communication systems. Sarah had thought of this too. They would use hand signals and predetermined timing. Each team would approach their target and wait for Sarah's signal. When all teams were in position, they would plant their charges with 5-minute timers and retreat immediately. The first team would consist of Sarah herself and 2 soldiers. They would target the command tank, which was the largest and most heavily armored vehicle in the convoy. The second team, led by Martinez, would take the tank positioned on the eastern side of the formation. The third team, under Williams, would attack the western tank. Sarah gathered all her soldiers and explained the mission. She was honest about the risks involved. This wasn't a guaranteed success, and some of them might not make it back. But if they did nothing, the enemy would eventually hunt them down anyway. At least this way, they had a chance to complete their original mission. The soldiers looked nervous, but none of them objected. They had trained for dangerous missions, and they trusted their commander. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her unit as she watched them prepare for what might be their most difficult challenge. Each soldier checked their equipment one final time. Personal weapons were cleaned and loaded. Explosive charges were armed and tested. Communication devices were set to the backup frequency that hopefully hadn't been compromised by the electronic interference. Sarah studied the enemy positions one more time through her binoculars. The tanks had spread out slightly, which would make coordination more difficult, but also meant that if one team was discovered, the others might still have a chance to complete their missions. The enemy infantry appeared relaxed, confident in their defensive positions. They were scanning the hills above them but paying little attention to the approach routes that Sarah had identified. This overconfidence might be exactly what her unit needed. As the teams prepared to move out, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came before every dangerous mission. This was why she had become a soldier, for moments when everything depended on skill, courage, and the trust between teammates. The sun was reaching its peak, which would provide the best cover for their approach. The heat would interfere with thermal imaging, and the bright light would make it harder for the enemy to spot movement in the shadows of the rocks and creek beds. Sarah gave the final signal, and the 3 teams began their descent toward the valley floor. Each group took a different route, moving slowly and carefully to avoid detection. The real battle was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether they could get close enough to turn their simple explosives into weapons capable of destroying enemy tanks. As Sarah crawled through the first creek bed, her heart pounded. with anticipation. Behind her, she could hear the soft footsteps of her teammates following her lead. Ahead lay the most dangerous approach of her military career. The approach took nearly 45 minutes of careful crawling and hiding. Sarah's team moved through a series of shallow gullies that provided just enough cover to keep them hidden from the enemy sentries. Every few meters, they had to stop and wait while enemy soldiers walked past or when helicopters flew overhead. Sarah's uniform was completely soaked with sweat and covered in dirt by the time they reached their final position. She was less than 50 meters from the command tank, close enough to see the individual rivets on its armor plating. The massive vehicle sat like a sleeping monster, its main gun pointed toward the hills where the enemy expected an attack to come from. Through her scope, Sarah could see 2 enemy soldiers standing near the tank, smoking cigarettes and talking casually. They seemed completely unaware that enemy forces had penetrated their defensive perimeter. Their relaxed attitude would work in Sarah's favor, but it also meant they might react quickly if they spotted anything suspicious. Sarah checked her watch and saw that they were exactly on schedule. According to the plan, Martinez's team should be approaching their target from the east, while Williams' team came from the west. They had agreed to wait until exactly noon before beginning the final assault. The explosive charges they carried were powerful enough to disable any tank, but they had to be placed correctly. Sarah had studied the technical manuals and knew that the best placement was near the tracks or on the engine compartment. A charge in the right location would not only destroy the vehicle, but also eliminate any crew inside. With 10 minutes remaining, before the attack, Sarah began her final approach. She crawled on her belly through a narrow depression in the ground, moving so slowly that it took her almost 5 minutes to cover 20 meters. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid making noise or attracting attention. The 2 enemy soldiers were still talking, but Sarah could see that one of them was beginning to look around more carefully. Perhaps he had heard something, or maybe it was just routine caution. Either way, Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Behind her, Corporal Jackson and Private Torres were following her exact path. Both were experienced, soldiers who understood the importance of staying completely silent during this phase of the mission. Sarah had chosen them specifically because they had proven themselves in similar situations before. As Sarah reached the edge of the tank's defensive perimeter, she could hear the enemy soldiers' conversation clearly. They were discussing their plans for after the mission, completely unaware that their lives were about to change dramatically. Sarah almost felt sorry for them, but she remembered that these were the same soldiers who had killed many of her friends in previous battles. The command tank was even larger up close than it had appeared from the hills. Its armor was thick and covered with additional protective plates, but Sarah knew that no amount of armor could protect against explosives placed directly against the hull. The charges they carried were specifically designed for this type of close-quarters sabotage. Sarah checked her watch again. 3 minutes remained. She began to remove the explosive charge from her pack, being extremely careful not to make any sound. The device was about the size of a lunchbox but contained enough explosive power to destroy a building. Attached to it was a magnetic clamp that would hold it firmly against the tank's metal surface. Suddenly, one of the enemy soldiers dropped his cigarette and began walking directly toward Sarah's position. She froze completely, pressing herself against the ground and hoping that the camouflage paint on her face would help her blend into the shadows. The soldier was less than 10 meters away and looking directly in her direction. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly that she was afraid the enemy soldier might hear it. She gripped her sidearm, ready to fire if necessary, but knowing that any gunshot would alert the entire convoy and ruin the mission. Everything depended on maintaining the element of surprise for just a few more minutes. The soldier stopped walking and stood still for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could see his face clearly now, and she realized he was younger than she had expected, probably no more than 20 years old. He looked nervous and uncertain, scanning the area around the tank but not seeming to focus on any particular threat. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, the young soldier turned and walked back to his companion. Sarah waited another full minute before resuming her movement, making sure that both soldiers were distracted before she attempted to reach the tank itself. With 1 minute remaining before the coordinated attack, Sarah reached the side of the command tank. The metal surface was hot from sitting in the desert sun, and she could hear the low hum of internal systems running inside. She positioned the explosive charge exactly where her training had taught her it would do the most damage. The magnetic clamp attached to the tank with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud to Sarah's nervous ears. She set the timer for 5 minutes, giving herself and her team enough time to retreat to a safe distance before the explosion. The red digital display began counting down immediately. Now came the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Sarah had to retreat from her position without being detected while her teammates were simultaneously placing their own charges. If even one team was discovered before all the explosives were in place, the entire operation could fail. Sarah began her retreat, crawling backward through the same depression she had used to approach the tank. Every movement had to be perfect, because the slightest noise could alert the enemy soldiers. She could hear her teammates behind her, following her lead as they moved away from the target. The 2 enemy soldiers were still talking, but Sarah noticed that they seemed more alert now. One of them kept looking around the perimeter, and she wondered if they had somehow sensed that something was wrong. Military experience often gave soldiers an instinct for danger that was difficult to explain. When Sarah reached the first piece of substantial cover, she turned to check on the other teams. Through her binoculars, she could see Martinez's group retreating from their position near the eastern tank. They appeared to have completed their mission successfully and were moving back toward the rally point. Williams's team was harder to spot, but Sarah caught a glimpse of movement near the western tank that suggested they were also retreating. If everything had gone according to plan, all 3 tanks now had explosive charges attached to them, set to detonate within the next 3 minutes. Sarah led her team toward the predetermined rally point, a rocky outcropping about 300 meters from the enemy convoy. They would wait there until the explosions occurred, then assess the damage and plan their next move. The mission wasn't over until they confirmed that all targets had been destroyed. As they climbed toward the rally point, Sarah heard voices behind them. The enemy soldiers were becoming suspicious about something. Perhaps they had found tracks in the dirt, or maybe one of the charges had been spotted. Either way, the situation was becoming more dangerous with each passing second. Martinez's team reached the rally point first, breathing heavily from their rapid retreat. Martinez reported that they had successfully placed their charge on the eastern tank, but had nearly been discovered by a patrol that appeared unexpectedly. They had been forced to hide under a supply truck for several minutes while enemy soldiers walked past. Williams's team arrived moments later with similar news. They had completed their mission but had encountered more enemy soldiers than expected. Williams suspected that the enemy was beginning to realize that their perimeter had been breached. The relaxed atmosphere that had helped the mission so far was quickly disappearing. Sarah checked her watch and saw that they had less than 2 minutes before the first explosion. She gathered her soldiers around her and explained what would happen next. The explosions would create chaos and confusion among the enemy forces. Sarah's unit would use this opportunity to attack any remaining vehicles and eliminate enemy soldiers who survived the initial blasts. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see increased activity around the enemy convoy. Soldiers were moving more quickly and purposefully. Some were climbing into vehicles while others were taking defensive positions. Something had definitely alerted them to the danger. Then Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. An enemy soldier was walking directly toward the command tank, and he appeared to be looking at something on the side of the vehicle. If he discovered the explosive charge, he might be able to remove it or at least warn the others before it detonated. Sarah raised her rifle and prepared to take the shot if necessary. At this distance, she could easily hit the enemy soldier, but firing would alert the entire convoy and might cause them to spread out before the explosions occurred. She had to make a split-second decision that could determine the success of the entire mission. The enemy soldier stopped directly next to the explosive charge. Sarah could see him leaning closer to examine it. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she prepared to fire. But then the soldier straightened up and walked away, apparently satisfied that what he had seen was just a normal part of the tank's equipment. With 30 seconds remaining on the timer, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and intense anticipation. The hardest part of the mission was almost over. In less than a minute, they would know whether their desperate plan had succeeded or failed completely. The enemy soldiers were still moving around the convoy, but none of them seemed to realize what was about to happen. Sarah watched as several climbed into the command tank, unknowingly sealing their fate. She felt no satisfaction at the thought of their deaths, but she knew that war required difficult choices. Martinez whispered that he could see enemy soldiers near his target tank as well. The timing couldn't have been worse, but there was nothing they could do now except wait for the explosions and hope that their plan would work. 10 seconds remained on Sarah's watch. She signaled for her soldiers to take cover behind the rocks and prepare for the massive explosions that were about to occur. The shock waves would be powerful enough to knock them down if they weren't properly protected. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The first explosion came from the eastern tank, a massive blast that sent flames and debris high into the air. The shock wave hit Sarah's position a moment later, shaking the ground and causing rocks to fall around them. Before the sound of the first explosion had faded, the second and third charges detonated almost simultaneously. The valley filled with smoke, fire, and the screams of wounded enemy soldiers. Sarah's desperate plan had worked, but now came the most dangerous part of the mission, confirming the damage and eliminating any remaining threats. The explosions had been even more powerful than Sarah expected. All 3 tanks were completely destroyed, their twisted metal frames burning fiercely in the desert heat. Secondary explosions continued as ammunition inside the vehicles ignited, sending projectiles flying in all directions. Sarah waited for the initial chaos to subside before leading her team down toward the convoy. Through the smoke and flames, she could see enemy soldiers running in all directions. Some were trying to help wounded comrades, while others were attempting to establish defensive positions using the remaining supply trucks. The supply vehicles had been damaged by the tank explosions, but several were still intact. Sarah knew that these trucks likely contained weapons, ammunition, or other valuable military supplies that needed to be destroyed to complete the mission successfully. Martinez's team approached from the east while Williams's group came from the west, just as they had during the initial assault. The coordination they had developed during the first phase of the mission was proving valuable now as they moved to eliminate the remaining threats. Enemy soldiers began firing at Sarah's approaching forces, but their shots were wild and uncoordinated. The massive explosions had destroyed their command structure and left them confused about what was happening. Many were still dazed from the shock waves and unable to fight effectively. Sarah's team reached the first supply truck and found it filled with ammunition and explosive devices. Private Torres quickly placed charges inside the vehicle while Sarah and Jackson provided cover. They had learned to work quickly and efficiently during their approach to the tanks, and these skills were serving them well now. The enemy resistance was stronger than Sarah had hoped, but weaker than she had feared. About 15 enemy soldiers were still capable of fighting, but they were scattered across the area and unable to coordinate their defense. Sarah's unit had the advantage of mobility and superior tactics. Martinez radioed that his team had secured 2 more supply trucks and eliminated several enemy soldiers who had been trying to set up a machine gun position. His voice was calm and professional, showing the same leadership qualities that had made him Sarah's most trusted sergeant. Williams reported from the western side of the convoy that they had encountered heavier resistance but were making progress. 3 enemy soldiers had barricaded themselves behind an overturned truck and were putting up a determined fight. Williams requested permission to use grenades to eliminate the threat. Sarah approved the request and watched as Williams' grenades exploded near the enemy position. The enemy fire stopped immediately, and Williams's team was able to advance and secure the remaining supply vehicles in that area. As the battle continued, Sarah realized that her unit was not just winning, but dominating the engagement. The enemy forces that had seemed so threatening from a distance were proving no match for her well-trained soldiers once their technological advantages had been eliminated. The key to their success was the aggressive tactics they had adopted after the rocket systems failed. Instead of trying to fight the enemy on equal terms, Sarah had chosen to use surprise and close-quarters combat to neutralize their advantages. The decision to get close enough to place manual charges had been risky, but it had worked perfectly. Within 20 minutes of the explosions, Sarah's forces had gained control of the entire convoy area. The remaining enemy soldiers had either been eliminated or had fled into the surrounding desert. All military vehicles and supply trucks had been destroyed or captured. Sarah gathered her soldiers to assess their situation. Remarkably, none of her people had been seriously injured during the entire operation. They had a few minor cuts and bruises from crawling through the rocks, but everyone was capable of continuing the mission. The destroyed tanks were still burning, sending thick black smoke high into the sky. Sarah knew that this smoke would be visible for miles and would likely attract attention from other enemy units in the area. They needed to complete their mission and withdraw quickly. Martinez reported finding several cases of advanced military equipment in one of the supply trucks. The enemy had been transporting sophisticated weapons and communication devices that would have been used to attack Sarah's forces and other units in the region. Destroying this equipment was almost as important as eliminating the tanks. Williams had discovered documents and maps that provided valuable intelligence about enemy operations in the area. These papers contained information about future convoy routes, supply schedules, and defensive positions that could be extremely useful to military planners. Sarah made the decision to gather as much intelligence as possible before destroying the remaining vehicles. They loaded captured documents and equipment into their own vehicles while preparing charges to destroy everything else. Nothing useful could be left for enemy reinforcements. As her soldiers worked to complete the mission, Sarah reflected on what they had accomplished. When their sophisticated rocket systems had failed, she could have chosen to retreat and report the failure. Instead, she had adapted quickly and found a way to complete the mission using basic tactics and equipment. The success of the mission proved that sometimes the simplest approaches were the most effective. High-tech weapons were valuable, but they could be defeated by electronic warfare or simple mechanical failure. Well-trained soldiers with basic equipment and good leadership could overcome almost any obstacle. Sarah's radio crackled with a message from headquarters requesting a status update. She was about to deliver news that would surprise everyone back at base. Not only had her unit completed their mission despite complete equipment failure, but they had achieved better results than anyone had expected. Sarah keyed her radio and delivered her report to headquarters. The voice on the other end was silent for several long moments after she described the complete destruction of the enemy convoy. When the response finally came, it was filled with disbelief and requests for confirmation. Colonel Mitchell, Sarah's commanding officer, had difficulty accepting that a unit with failed equipment had not only survived an encounter with superior enemy forces, but had completely destroyed them. He asked Sarah to repeat her report twice before acknowledging that he understood the situation. The intelligence materials that Williams had recovered proved to be even more valuable than initially thought. The documents revealed that the destroyed convoy had been carrying supplies for a major enemy offensive planned for the following week. By eliminating these resources, Sarah's unit had potentially saved hundreds of Allied lives. More importantly, the maps and communication codes they had captured provided detailed information about enemy positions throughout the region. This intelligence would allow Allied forces to plan more effective operations and avoid enemy ambushes for weeks to come. As Sarah's unit prepared to withdraw from the battle site, they received word that enemy reinforcements were approaching from two directions. The smoke from the burning tanks had indeed attracted attention, just as Sarah had feared. They had perhaps 30 minutes before hostile forces would arrive in strength. The withdrawal was complicated by the need to transport the captured intelligence materials and wounded enemy prisoners. Sarah had found several enemy soldiers who had survived the tank explosions, but were too badly injured to escape. Military protocol required that they provide medical aid and transport these prisoners to Allied facilities. Martinez organized the evacuation while Sarah coordinated with headquarters for helicopter support. The nearest medical facility was 40 miles away, too far to transport wounded prisoners in ground vehicles while avoiding enemy patrols. They would need air evacuation to complete the mission successfully. 2 helicopters arrived just as enemy scouts appeared on the eastern ridge. Sarah's soldiers quickly loaded the intelligence materials and wounded prisoners while maintaining defensive positions around the landing zone. The pilots kept their engines running, ready to take off immediately if enemy forces got too close. Sarah was the last person to board the evacuation helicopter, making sure that all her soldiers and the captured materials were safely loaded. As the aircraft lifted off, she looked down at the destroyed convoy and felt a sense of pride in what her unit had accomplished under impossible circumstances. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to think about the lessons learned from the mission. The failure of their high-tech equipment had initially seemed like a disaster, but it had forced them to rely on fundamental military skills that proved more reliable than sophisticated machinery. During the flight, Sergeant Martinez approached Sarah and expressed his amazement at how the mission had developed. He admitted that when the rocket systems failed, he had thought they would have to abort the operation and return to base empty-handed. The decision to proceed with manual tactics had seemed like suicide at first. Williams joined the conversation and pointed out that the success of the mission had depended entirely on Sarah's leadership and willingness to take calculated risks. A less experienced commander might have chosen the safer option of withdrawal when the equipment failed. Sarah deflected their praise, emphasizing that the mission had succeeded because of teamwork and the exceptional skills of every soldier in the unit. The manual placement of explosive charges had required courage and precision from everyone involved, not just leadership from her. When they reached base, Sarah was immediately called to a debriefing session with Colonel Mitchell and several other senior officers. The success of the mission had attracted attention at the highest levels of command, and everyone wanted to understand exactly how it had been accomplished. The debriefing lasted for several hours as Sarah explained every detail of the operation. The officers were particularly interested in the tactics used to approach the enemy tanks without detection, and the coordination required to place multiple charges simultaneously. Colonel Mitchell informed Sarah that her mission report would be studied by tactical instructors and used to develop new training programs. The techniques her unit had developed during the crisis would be taught to other soldiers facing similar challenges. 3 weeks later, Sarah received notification that she was being recommended for promotion and decoration for exceptional leadership under combat conditions. More importantly to her, every member of her unit was being recognized for their courage and skill during the mission. The intelligence gathered during the mission led to the success of several other operations over the following months. Enemy positions were neutralized, supply lines were disrupted, and countless Allied lives were saved because of the information Sarah's unit had captured. Years later, Sarah would look back on the mission as the defining moment of her military career. It had taught her that the most sophisticated equipment was useless without skilled soldiers and effective leadership. When technology failed, human courage and ingenuity had proven more than adequate to accomplish the impossible. The story of the failed rocket systems and the manual destruction of enemy tanks became legendary within Sarah's division. New soldiers were told the story as an example of how determination and creative thinking could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might initially appear.